Joining us now, Pennsylvania Attorney General Josh Shapiro. Thank you so much for spending some time with us. Your response to this lawsuit seemed to garner more reaction and coverage than the lawsuit itself. The lawsuit seemed to be recognized as being ludicrous and foolish. Your Republican counterpart in Georgia, I think, called it, morally and legally dubious. Why do you think 126 Republican members of Congress signed on to its mission?
Well, first off, maybe my brief should have been much shorter and just said "over my dead body," because that really does sum up how I feel and how hard I'm going to work to protect the will of the people of Pennsylvania. Look, it's actually unbelievable that 17 other attorneys general and 120 some members of Congress who swore an oath to the Constitution of the United States would instead act as though they've sworn an oath to Donald Trump. There is no legal basis for this lawsuit that Texas has filed. It is without merit. It is procedurally flawed. And it is ludicrous, as you said. And the fact that so many Republicans have gone along with it speaks volumes, not about the legal filing from Texas, but about the problems in the Republican Party. And frankly, the problems with the character of those individuals who have signed on to this. I said the other day, and I'll repeat, I don't know if they need a surgeon to repair their spines or a psychiatrist to examine their heads. But something is wrong with these people that they are willing to follow Donald Trump as far as he is trying to take them.
Well, I would add there's something wrong with us for thinking that there was a bottom. People who've covered Donald Trump and the Republican Party's total capitulation and subservience to him always thought there'd be a tripwire. And I think a lot of people thought that tripwire could have been a deadly pandemic, or it could have been the killing of George Floyd, or could have been anything that happened to the country. But it appears that nothing ever happens to the country in the eyes of today's GOP. It happens to their guy, their leader, Donald Trump. And to that end, I want you just to address the intellectual dishonesty. There are now Republican members of Congress seeking to invalidate elections that return them to Congress.
Right, Nicolle. I mean, that is the most amazing thing of the 120 or so members of the House. I think 7 or 8 of them are from Pennsylvania. I mean, they literally filed a brief in the United States Supreme Court saying their own elections should be invalidated, which just speaks to their character flaws and speaks to this issue, this grip that Donald Trump has on them. Look, I've said many times that this is an insignificant legal filing. It really is. And I think legal experts on the left and right have backed me up on that. But this action of supporting something like this is not insignificant. And it is a cancer that exists in our country that is going to require all of us to do our part to repair. Donald Trump has left an extraordinary amount of damage in this country. And when he leaves on January 20th, as Joe Biden is sworn in as the next president, that destruction will still exist. And it's going to take time to work that through. And I think that's what we're learning from this Texas case and from these other circumstances where these individuals are literally willing to put Donald Trump before country, Donald Trump before the oath of office that they took. It is both sad and scary, and it should be a wake-up call to everyone in this country that there's work to do.
I want to just pick up on 2 things that you said. You used the word seditious and you used the word scary. One of the things that scares me is that these lawsuits, and I think the Trump campaign, a lot of them took place in your state, and you had to, fight back, and you won all of them. They've all been frivolous. They've all been without merit. The Trump campaign has lost all of them. But a lot of Trump supporters, and because of the way they're covered on conservative media outlets, still have hope. And I wonder what you are concerned about, if anything, on the day that Joe Biden is sworn in, because none of these legal efforts have merit. The lifelong Republican in charge of protecting our elections said this was the most secure election in our country's history with no fraud. Bill Barr, the Trumpiest of all Trump cabinet secretaries, the attorney general, has said there was no fraud that would have changed the outcome of the election. And yet there's this wacky, bonkers lawsuit that is giving hope to the 70 million people who voted for Donald Trump. False hope.
Yeah. Look, this wacky, bonkers lawsuit, as you call it, and I think correctly, so this will be in the rearview mirror soon, within, days, if not hours. But the damage will continue. It used to be in this country where we would have serious disagreements over tax policy or healthcare policy or foreign policy.
I miss those days.
I miss those days, too. That's a healthy part of our democracy. But right now, we can't even agree on a basic set of facts in this country. And that is something Donald Trump is not only seizing on, he seems to take delight and glee in further dividing this nation, even after he was rejected at the polls in a safe and secure election. We're going to be dealing with this for some time, whether it's people trusting the science behind a vaccine or people believing something that is taught in schools. And I think we have to get back as Americans to a basic foundation, agreeing to a basic set of facts, so that we can then return to those honest disagreements we can have over policy, which strengthen our nation and allow us to move forward and perfect our union.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.